Strawberry Fields Forever, one of the most famous intros to a record. But when it was first heard back in 1967, few people knew about the instrument that had created it. But by the end of the year, it was like a rash breaking out all over pop music. The Mellotron. And in the past 30 years, I've owned and sold, loved and loathed dozens of Mellotrons, an instrument that made one-man bands sound like beat groups sound like an orchestra, and kept at least one member of the royal family very happy. In the late 1970s, it fell out of favour as synthesizers and samplers made them sound wheezy and old-fashioned. But now the current kings of pop, Oasis, are heading up a revival. To find out why, you have to go back to the late 40s and an American inventor called Harry Chamberlain, who nurtured a dream to create a one-man orchestra. In 1948, he came up with an instrument which he called, not surprisingly, the Chamberlain. He used audio tapes to store recordings of musical instruments which could be played back as notes on a keyboard. But Harry struggled for 15 years to make it work properly, but he did manage to invent the intermittent windscreen wiper in the process. In 1962, one of his salesmen, Bill Franson, came to England to find a partner to make the difficult bit, the playback heads for the machine. Bill stumbled upon Les Bradley, whose company Bradmatic made electrical components just a stone's throw from Aston Villa football ground. As his grandson John remembers, Les fell in love with the Chamberlain.
Les told me when he saw this thing and Bill started to play it, they were just so knocked out and he couldn't sleep. When he got home, he just could not sleep that night. It was all, the music was whizzing around in his head. And of course, the long and short of it is instead of making the heads, they produced the whole thing. Bill came over in 62, and they spent until sort of the middle of 63 trying to sort out finance. And eventually, they got Eric Robinson interested, the band leader, and the Eric Robinson organisation actually funded it.
Eric Robson arranged for the recording of all the musical instruments featured on the Mellotron, everything from a single flute to entire passages played by brass bands and skiffle groups. Robson drafted in his son-in-law, David Nixon, the TV magician, for some extra cash and to help generate publicity. And lo, at the very end of 1963, the Mellotronics Company was created and the Mellotron was born.
No, you weren't listening to an orchestra, but one person sitting at the keyboard of this truly wonderful instrument of the 60s, the Mellotron. The sound you heard was only one of the thousands of combinations which are at your fingertips. What a thrill to have a complete rhythm section at your command with one finger. And there are 20 different rhythms to choose from.
As this early demo record makes clear, Mellotronics had a very specific market in mind. John Bradley now runs a rejuvenated version of the Mellotron Company with Martin Smith.
It was seen as a one-man band. You could put the machine into a club or a pub or something like that, plug it in, and it was self-sufficient. As long as you had someone to play it, buy them a few beers, then you've got entertainment. It was never intended at that stage to do with beat groups, if you like to call them that.
Even after groups had started using the machine, like the Beatles and the Moody's, they still designed yet another home entertainment version of the keyboard, still not realising that it was really a groups thing. So they'd actually missed probably 3 or 4 years of real big sales.
Unbelievable, isn't it? And one finger at that.
One of the first in the queue for the Mellotron was Princess Margaret. She was closely followed by her mate, Peter Sellers. It was always going to be the rich and famous who could afford one at £1,000 a time. For the pop groups who did come across one, the first impression was of something pretty tacky, as Paul McCartney demonstrates.
You know, round about those days, it's also sort of a little bit sleazy, a little bit cabaret, but you get stuff like this. I love the sound. Ooh, come on, baby. Can I buy you a drink?
Oh, all right. Where you from then?
I'm with the government.
All right. I'll have a gin in it.
Welcome to the castle. Quite a windy night out here. But you know, I always love it here in Herschwig von Schlechtstein.
Who's this Hans character? I've never heard of him.
Don't worry, my darling. We're all together. Woo! You can have a lot of fun on these things. Oh, I'll tell you.
It was in 1965 that most pop fans and musicians got to hear about the Tron through a TV appearance. Blue Weaver, later a member of Amen Corner, the Straubs and the veteran of A Million Sessions, was one of them.
I think it was Ready, Steady, Go. It was Graham Bond organisation. Mm-hmm. And Graham was sat there, who was larger than life in any case. Then he had this monstrous thing in front of him again. And then he started to play...
John Bradley.
The Mellotron has been described in many ways, one of which is 70 tape recorders in a box. And the basic concept is, with the original Mark II, you've got 70 tapes. When you press the key, it actually drives the tape and pulls it out of a storage loop, which is spring-loaded. So as soon as you let go of the key, then it will return to the start.
One of the Tron's biggest fans is Jean-Michel Jarre.
They were probably the craziest instrument you could imagine. I mean, the Mellotron, when you think of it, when you think of what it is, I mean, somebody thought to replace the string of a piano by a tape and to replace the hammer by a tape head. When you play a key, the tape head, instead of the hammer, plays the tape. And then it was the first sampler ever. And you could play chords, and you could play orchestra. It was the dream of any musician of that time to be able to, for a pianist, to play orchestra, full orchestra.
But one of the drawbacks was the length of sustain of the note. Only 8 seconds. The tape ended, and you had to release your finger. A little notice on the keyboard told you to. This seriously affected the way you played it. Blue Weaver and myself recently met up in a rehearsal studio to play a Mark IV Mellotron. My first time in 15 years. Hit one note so you can hear what it sounds like when it finishes.
Oh, yeah, the click. Yeah. Beautiful. No click.
Unbelievable. Let's try another note. You've got a tape recorder in your pocket. I've never known of one not click.
No click.
That's unusual, isn't it?
Just, you see, natural. It would click if you hit it too hard, because obviously you're pushing the yeah, but I used to use that to effect.
Yeah, it's a really nice effect, that. The turnaround in the Mellotron's fortunes was partly down to one of Mellotronic's employees, a young lad called Mike Pinder.
I responded to an ad in the Birmingham Mail, and it turned out to be Strictly Electronics. And then I ended up as quality control at the end of the line. I'll always remember seeing the Mellotron for the first time. It was like a portal to the future, like landing on the moon. A giant step for Mike Pinder.
Mike was also a member of a beat group himself, the MB5. Soon he chucked in his to follow up their initial success with Go Now and recruited new band members, Justin Hayward and Graham Edge. Mike Pinder thought that a Mellotron might just help create a new sound for them.
Well, the Mellotron took a very big part, didn't it? If you listen to all of those Moody's albums we made, I think
Beatles on their last tour of England in 1966, and Mike helped to turn John and Paul onto the Mellotron. The effect was clear when their next record came out. Paul McCartney.
This is a Wings Mellotron. EMI had one, and we used to record there. One of the first uses we ever put was flutes on the front of Strawberry Fields, and I played a little sort of thing on the front of John's song there that really gave it like a distinctive character. I think I've still got the flutes up on here, something like this.
Everyone followed.
Suddenly there were odd sounds in records that you're sort of thinking, is that a Hammond organ? Is that some sort of organ? When Simon Bates used to do the Golden Hour, John and I used to love the year 1967 because it was on everything.
Manfred Mann was another major Tron user and abuser in the 60s, with two of his biggest hits based on it.
The thing was great fun to play with, I think. You know, we try to use it at every possible... I mean, Ha Ha Said the Clown is virtually made with it. It's comping, quang, 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 doing the fours. It's going... da-da-dum. That's a sort of trombone thing or something. Flutes, whistles, I mean, everything we could possibly do.
Mr. James and Ha Ha Said the Clown are 90% Mellotron.
Kites by Simon Dupree and the Big Sound.
Yeah.
That's
Hole in My Shoe, Traffic.
Brian Auger and the Trinity.
This Wheel's on Fire.
Yeah.
And of course Space Oddity.
David Bowie. Yeah.
The keyboard on that was played by, or the Mark II rather, was played by Rick Wakeman.
Ah, yes, Space Oddity. Everyone seems to think I got £100 for that session. Sadly, far from the truth. £9 closer. That'll do. It's the best it's ever going to sound. That's great. What had happened was Tony Visconti had done a string arrangement, and it tended to make Space Oddity sound like I know it's a bit of a contradiction in terms, sound a bit like a song. You know, this is ground control, and they wanted to get it a bit more harsh and more rounded. So the idea was for me to come in and do Mellotron to actually coincide with all the strings. And what happened in the end was the strings came off. And we left, and I just double-tracked this. And I'm not going to sing it because otherwise everybody will start turning off. And it's just literally double.
Actually 5, because you could have flutes.
That's true.
You
could split them in between, that's it. You could actually get it right in between.
Strings and flutes.
That's it. Yeah.
Or you could have strings and cellos.
It was never actually meant to, but we all did it. That's quite right.
Yeah, in between.
But my favourite...
So you got an extra 2 songs.
My favourite Mellotron, I have to say, was on the Call of the Crimson King for the King Crimson, which was just so...
it was the...
Yeah. I mean, absolutely brilliant. By 1970, Mellotronics were hitting their stride and recognising the needs of rock bands. The Mark IV was introduced, the best known of all trons. It was the most reliable yet, although that wasn't saying very much. The Mark IV was the little white keyboard that you've seen on stage at practically every gig throughout the 70s. It was the era of progressive rock, and the Mellotron was perfect for it. Martin Smith.
When you can go on stage and suddenly you can produce a choir, then it inspires you to drag the piece out, because the audience are loving it, you're having an ego trip, and you can make a very simple song sound enormous. Mellotrons are one of the few instruments that you can play one note and get away with it, and it sounds colossal.
But taking Mellotrons on tour was a nightmare. They were highly temperature sensitive and didn't respond well to hot, sweaty gigs, followed by cold, drafty vans. They went in tune and out again in the time between soundcheck and showtime. I had more arguments with John Anderson in Yes about the Tron than practically anything else. Even Blue Weaver, probably its staunchest defender, had his problems at the Straub's open-air gigs in America.
This was August, I remember. Mellotron sitting on stage all afternoon, came to the evening. I used to do this sort of similar to a Graham Bond thing. I think I must have nicked the idea from him again, where I'd creep on stage, the lights would go down, and I'd hit this monstrous chord, 10,000 watts cranked up, play this thing, try and impress everybody instantly, But what had happened was the sun had been on the instrument all day. As the rollers hit the tapes, all the tapes just stretched completely and crept on, went up to the keyboard, hit the chord, and this horrific. Yeah.
Oh, it's great. That was another classic. When I used to do those runs, I used to go for example of that. And then it hit that, and then John would start singing. But if the pitch started going, you'd get. And John looked round, I sort of put my fingers up and I could hear everything he knew, references to parentage and whatever. And there was nothing you could do. And when it started doing the so you'd hit one note. And especially if it was a delicate bit, worse on the flutes. So you'd do your little line or whatever. I mean,
it's so wonderful about it. I mean,
I'm sure the guy who invented the TV program The Clangers did it on a Duff Mellotron going. I mean, one of the things that Blue will agree with, I'm sure, is that when a note started slipping, it didn't get better. It tended to get thunderingly worse, correct? So by the 14th one, it was...
Yes, but the audience would think that was wonderful. They'd think it was, it was part of the act.
German keyboard wizards Tangerine Dream were major Mellotron users in the 70s, taking several on tour. Edgar Froese.
We put it on the headset on one ear, and then we were listening to the tone of the Mellotron while already started playing our stuff, And then by listening to the 440 hertz out of the oscillator, we were tuning the Mellotron against it. So that was the only way of doing it, and that had to be done about 10 times during the gig of 2.5 hours. Looking back to those days, that sort of adventurous fear, not knowing if you will overcome a good, a bad concert, a out-of-tune concert or whatever. Today, everything, it's much better tuned, it's nearly perfect, but it's not having a wild ride through the jungle anymore.
But the problems of being on the road don't seem to worry Julian Cope, probably the instrument's biggest fan amongst younger musicians.
King Crimson took 5 on tour, and they all broke down. We took 2 on tour. We used the same one all the way through, apart from one show, and that's because I tipped wine down it. We are righteous Mellotron users. There's higher forces looking after the Mellotron.
About where the sound was coming from. Mike Pinder.
It wasn't until people would come and see us playing live, then I would watch people meander to the front of the stage, and they would be stretching their necks looking for 15 bald guys playing violins at the back of the stage, you know.
But the bald guys tried to exact revenge, and after Graham Bond's appearance on TV, the Musicians' Union put a ban on the Mellotron and forced bands to compensate musicians whose jobs they thought were under threat because of it, as Edgar Froese found out when Tangerine Dream played the Albert Hall in 1975.
A couple of hours prior to the start of the gig, someone came along and said they're asking for a couple of £1,000 for you are using an orchestra. You are not using them. You are using your bloody keys here, and that's an orchestra. And so there was a bit of a fight going on backstage, and so we had to pay something that night.
Now things have come full circle. Whilst the musicians who played on the original tapes once claimed copyright, now the bands that use them in a distinctive way have the upper hand. Julian Coe.
For the start of Bungalow Bill, they used a Mellotron playing, maybe it's like some amazing Spanish guitar thing. People don't know the Mellotron's capable of that. They never think that anyone's going to be so sneaky as to use the 8 seconds for something like that. So when we found it on the Mellotron Mark II, I thought, wow, we've got to use it for the start of this song called Arthur. So we put it on, and then the record company said, oh, you've sampled the start of Bungalow Bill. And I said, yeah, well, it isn't actually the start of Bungalow Bill, it's the Mellotron sample. Oh, you can't do that because the Beatles probably own it. I don't want to be involved with the big arguments because it probably would be a big argument. But I was very disappointed. I thought it would have to be public domain.
In 1977, the Mellotron's American distribution company went bust, and it eventually brought Mellotronics down with them. In a liquidation blunder, the rights to the name were sold to an American company, so back in Britain the Bradleys had to become Strictly Electronics and use the name Novatron for the instruments. But by then the instrument was on the slide. Digital technology and the sampler swept the Tron from the pop industry almost as quickly. In the 90s, a new generation of bands have found their appeal, attracted by the 60s associations, the organic sound, and Radiohead. So many people want them that John Bradley and Martin Smith are trading again as Strictly Electronics, doing up knackered old machines and finding it hard to keep up with demand.
What we do here is we try and give people back a machine as it left the factory, as near as possible. The day it left the factory, that's what we give them back. But even we are having problems locating machines because although they're somewhere on the planet, there were 2,500 Mellotrons in total. So far, only 800 have come to light.
I've been cynical about them, but in fact I made heavy use of Mellotrons for more than a decade. We used to call them the Doctor. If you needed an extra colour for a track, it was just the ticket. In a way, Jean-Michel Jarre, Mr. High-Tech himself, is probably one of the most unlikely Mellotron fans, but he's now using one of Streetley's reconditioned Mellotrons on tour.
After having explored various ways in the 80s with digital instruments and computers and all that, I suddenly thought that this instrument may well become Stradivarius of electronic music for the future. Classical musicians like Yehudi Menuhin, for instance, they're not using a violin made in Japan with all the modern technology. They're still searching an instrument that has been built in the 17th century. It proves that time is not necessarily linked with the craftsmanship attitude you can reach at one stage. With progress, sometimes you are gaining things, but you are also losing things. And such an instrument couldn't be done anymore.